So I'm delighted to be joined by art historian Dickon Hall, whom I'm sure many of you will know. We're planning to have a chat about three paintings by Colin Middleton that are included in our forthcoming sale of Important Irish Art on Wednesday, December the 8th. The three pictures are all oils. Two of them are quite early ones, and one is somewhat later, sort of an early 1970s. So I'm sure lots of you will be familiar with Dickon's work. He's the acknowledged expert on Colin Middleton and has written about the artist extensively and continues to contribute to our catalogues, for which we are immensely grateful. What is most useful about Dickon's writing in many ways is that even though they're just, the pieces that are written for the catalogues are relatively short, they give a lovely context to where the pictures lie in the artist's oeuvre. So what we're going to talk about now is, or at least the first one that we're going to talk about, is a picture called The Trojan Horse. And it was painted in 1942. And as lots of you will be aware, and I'm sure Dickon will sort of expound on this, that Middleton is probably best known as an artist who painted in a variety of styles. And one of the styles that is, very much sought after are the surrealist works. So Dickon, this is a superb work in that style, in that surrealist theme. Would you like to just tell us a little bit about this particular picture?
Absolutely. As you said, it's a beautiful little painting, and it sort of, in a way, is it sort of expresses so much about Middleton's work at that time. It contains so many elements of what his work was really about, ongoing as well. The painting was included in the 1943 exhibition he had at Belfast Museum and Art Gallery, now the Ulster Museum, which was an extraordinary, very large, very ambitious exhibition, which sort of explored in many ways a lot of autobiographical elements and also broader elements. So this painting, in my reading of it, and obviously it's a complicated painting that is open to a lot of different readings, but it brings together the wartime experience of Middleton, his own personal experience. There are elements of sort of the, which is quite interesting, the painting we're going to come on to as well, in terms of the effect of the Second World War, the bombing in Belfast. You see the buildings that are collapsing, but also a sense of a world where everything sort of turned upside down, a world where the sort of security of life has changed, and an element of sort of the powerlessness of the individual, and even seeing sort of toy soldier, there are references to childhood and sort of the impact of war on childhood, on innocence, but also that idea of the sort of the military aspect of war, the sort of, I think in Middleton's eyes, certainly the sort of futility of war. He was someone who's I think that would have been his sort of vision of things. He would have been someone who really felt that there was a sort of something very unsettling about everything that not only he had gone through in Belfast, but the world was going through. And but the painting also sort of brings in very personal elements. He'd been widowed just a couple of years before that, and I think there are ideas of sort of loss in these paintings, but it's certainly a picture that also expresses the great skill he has as a draftsman. I mean, there's immense sort of skill in this. There's beautiful use of color, lovely composition. I mean, everything in it really is sort of so beautifully and carefully arranged. And it sort of reminds us that still at that point he was working as a damask designer, even though he was a successful painter and regarded as possibly certainly the leading young painter in Northern Ireland. I would say one of the leading young painters in Ireland, even at that age of 33 when he had that exhibition. So this is a real if you're looking for something to really sum up a lot of the ideas of Middleton's early paintings, you would find them, I think, in this work.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what strikes me about Middleton, and in particular this sort of, well, I suppose throughout his entire career, is the level of his, um, his expressing his intellect in his work, which is something which we're not that exposed to in a lot of 20th century Irish art. He obviously coming from Belfast, and he struggled enough to try and sort of get himself recognised, even within the country. And it sounded like a lot of the critics, certainly south of the border, didn't really get him. They didn't really understand a lot of what he was at. And I suppose that was at a time when, the popular painters were painting, visions of, the west of Ireland, and, a lot of those sort of subjects that we're very familiar with from that period. But I think sort of Middleton sort of stands out as being quite unique in the sense that he's a very spiritual, obviously a very spiritually minded person, but also incredibly intellectual. But yet, as you say, coming from the point of view of, a damask designer and learning his trade to such an incredible extent, and the quality of the work is quite spectacular. And I think that he does definitely stand out, head and shoulders above virtually everybody else in that respect. And I suppose that's what makes him, continually interesting to us even today.
Yes, there's an incredible ambition in the work, and certainly that exhibition I mentioned. I mean, there are incredibly complex things going on in terms of working out the relationship of the artist to society, and how the artist can play a sort of positive role in many ways. And I think Middleton saw the analysis of society and the expression of broader issues. I mean, certainly he's very socially aware, and he would have seen the impact, say, of industrialization on individuals as well as the war, and then moving on from the war. I think there's this sort of idea of how you express the pain, the suffering, also the broader ideas of sort of anger that he had, and the shift we see from that very tightly finished, very controlled surrealist work in the Trojan Horse to something like How Many Miles to London Town, which was painted at a different stage of his career, a different stage of his life. But he'd gone through, the best part of a decade almost finding this sort of, between the two paintings. A lot of that had been spent trying to evolve a way of working that he felt more appropriate, more directly expressive of what he was sort of feeling, I think, coming out of the war. And, as a lot of images came out from Europe, from concentration camps, for example, in the post-war period, I think, the sort of the mood of Middleton's painting changes. And I think his attempt to sort of to find a much more immediately emotionally expressive voice. I mean, the early paintings are very intellectual, as you said, and there's an awful lot of meaning in them, and they have a great, they do have a great impact just purely, from the sort of arrangement of forms and the symbolism. But then the later work of that decade, in the very late 1940s, is much more directly expressive, much looser. There's almost something hallucinatory sometimes about it. And it was just that period whenever he met Victor Waddington, who really transformed his life in 1949 by giving him the financial stability to be able to paint full time. And then works like How Many Miles to London Town. Again, to me, it's a response to the war. It's a personal sort of, it's how I would read that painting. But also there's sort of this broader quest that each individual human has, that it is a spiritual quest as well that people go through in their lives, and a quest to sort of locate that identity, which was very crucial to Middleton because he was moving from the identity as a designer to a painter. And so that was very, very key to him. But, you see this development of, the works look very different. But to me, it's this attempt to take the same idea that he is working with in the early 40s And by the end of the 1940s, he's evolved a much more directly expressive way of working, which to him was more effective as a way of presenting those sort of ideas.
Yeah. What's interesting about How Many Miles to London Town is that it's variously dated. It's not actually dated on the painting. He hasn't inscribed the date on the back or on the front for that matter. But there's a suggestion that it was either painted in 1945 or actually in 1950. So what was happening there? Why is there this um, curious element to the dating of the picture?
Um, my guess would be, and this is just my guess, that when he was looking back, the painting was in the very, very, very large, very important 1976 retrospective that Middleton had, and he put together the list of pictures, I think, with John Hewitt, of what was going to be in that show. And I wonder whether he was looking back, 30 years and just got the date wrong.
Right, okay. It wasn't revisionism.
I don't know, but also it is quite interesting because at that time, in 1945, Middleton was beginning to work out how he could move to being a full-time painter. And in 1947, he and his wife and family moved to John Middleton Murray's farming commune in England and didn't stay there very long. Yeah. But before leaving, there were paintings he was working on that were, I mean, I mentioned this people see Middleton as someone who chopped and changed constantly, but actually I would say the move from the very tightly finished paintings in the 40s to the more expressionist ones was a very slow, gradual thing that happened over about 5 years. It might have been something he began before he went away to England. And then there were canvases that I think he probably came back to, maybe completed, because a lot of that time in England, he was working out and actually wrote very extensively about this. He was working out how to move from painting these very tightly finished paintings, which by then had become quite not commercially successful, but there certainly were collectors from them. He wanted to move on to a newer, more ambitious sort of painting. And in a way, this is typical of him. He was constantly pushing on to what he felt he needed to do. There was never really a sense of, like I can sell these now, I'll keep doing these. He was constantly moving on to something new. And so it could have been that he came back to the painting, but certainly it was shown, I think, under the name Candlelight with the Victor Waddington Gallery, and as in an early exhibition there. And Waddington supported Middleton. I mean, you said about how ambitious, the Trojan Horse is, to audiences in Belfast and Dublin in the early 40s, it would have been. But Waddington helped when there were, equally ambitious pictures like this that, he really supported Middleton at that time in terms of, saying these are important paintings. You have to, take your time, paint them, and they were generally well received. I mean, what's interesting is, one painting by Middleton was actually rejected by the Exhibition of Living Art around 1950. But generally, these paintings actually were seen by an audience in Dublin who were able to engage with them, and possibly the influence of Yeats in terms of expressionism helped.
Yes.
Because I think Middleton, there is that sort of connection in terms of expressionist painting. But it's a very powerful painting, and
but I just sort of get a sense in Colin's work just how serious the subject matter is. It's very close to the surface. They do take a lot of reading in the same way as a lot of Yeats's work takes a lot of reading. But I do have a sense that he was a serious-minded man, and he expresses that in a way that virtually nobody else does or did at the time, and particularly when you think about a lot of his peers that we know and love today, they don't come anywhere near him. But yet we find that in the third painting called Abstract with Toy Train, which appears to have been painted in the early 1970s for Morelli's ice cream parlor in Portstewart, that he's gone from being a very serious spiritual to something that's almost just in some ways just comes across as being an abstract pattern, but an absolutely exquisite one at the same time. And again, tells lovely stories about his, perhaps, his background in design. So where does this picture, fit into the themes of his work?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to bring in design again, and in many ways that's a significant element for Middleton, because this was, as you said, it was painted. I think a commission, I think by Noel Campbell, who was a very important figure in Middleton's life from the late 50s. Whenever Middleton's having a very difficult time economically, and also searching again for a new voice as a painter, and he'd been able to give up being a designer thanks to Waddington and the success they had together. And then in the late 50s, I think he actually felt freed enough, distant enough from being a designer to be able to look at that side of himself again. And so even though it is not apparently as and doesn't deal with the issues that the other two paintings deal with, there is certainly a sense that if you were looking at Middleton's work when he went back, I mean, I'm not sure of the exact date of this, but when he was doing these works for Noel Campbell, who was an extraordinarily ambitious architect at the time, there is a sense of actually a personal journey that Middleton is beginning to complete, that he's able to look at design not from point of view of someone who wants to leave it behind, which he had earlier, but from point of view of someone who realizes it's actually intrinsic to the way he paints. So there is an idea of showing off in a lot of these paintings. I think the work he did for Noel Campbell, and it fed back into his other painting. So the works that he did as commissions, it being Colin Middleton, they were never just thrown off. They were very seriously considered. They were carefully composed, and you can look at sort of there are elements of people like Paul Klee, I think, in these works. Artists he was very interested in and who had been influential in his earlier work, and sort of returned to these ideas of how you play around with imagery, how you abstract, how you get create rhythm. So again, it's just my personal view of it, but I think Middleton found the return to design that he was able to do thanks to Noel Campbell's commissions, I think, in the late 50s. It was an important part of sort of rediscovering that side of himself, and also it did have a great impact on the paintings in the 60s, well-known paintings in the 70s, even it's a square format, which I think is something that came back from design. And then I think from memory the lovely Australian watercolor you have in sale as well, that again is a square format. So these things became very, very influential in Middleton's later painting.
Yeah, and I think that what I love about the Abstract with Toy Train is the fun element to it. It's a picture that every single person, when I brought it into the sale room, having collected it from the owner, everybody stopped to look at it. All my colleagues, and they just it put a smile on everybody's face in a way that it's very immediate, but at the same time there's so much going on in the picture. There's all these lovely patterns. There's what look like llamas or alpacas, and then you've got the sort of the little girl, and you've got the train, and you've got all these repeated patterns in different colors and sizes, and it just fills you with just joy to look at. So which in some ways, when I think about, this was painted back in the early 1970s, when there wouldn't have been an awful lot of joy in certain areas of Northern Ireland. It was at the beginning of the Troubles, which were to have such an impact on so many people's lives, and not least on a lot of artists. So it's nice in a sense that we have this feeling of a little bit of lightheartedness, at a time when we were facing into not such an awful lot of lightheartedness in people's lives.
Yes, I mean, Middleton as a painter, it's interesting because, as you said, you have the late 60s, early 70s, not that distant in his mind from the the Second World War. And I know he almost connected the sort of the same mood, the same feeling from the Blitz, remembering that whenever there were events in the late 60s, early 70s that I think he sort of found connections. And I think Middleton did find humor and sort of visual invention very important in his painting. And at certain times it's more evident than others. But I think even in the Trojan Horse, which is a serious painting and deals with serious issues, but there's still a great sense of sort of wit and a sort of visual wit in it, and he transforms things into unexpected shapes, unexpected places. It's for all the different things going on, it's also a very enjoyable painting to look at. And as you said about the later painting as well, his work does have so much to look at in it. There's so many things that could be missed that are in there that compositions are so well put together that things never cry out for attention.
Yes,
but there's an awful lot there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that picture, the abstract, it reminds me of designs for a nice woolly jumper. Something that you might have seen sort of in Iceland, or it's just got that lovely sort of naive joy, which is something that we all need in our lives.
And I think the fact it was painted for, it was for somewhere that children are going to be going into on their holidays. Wanted to have that sense of it almost mirroring the world of the people in it. That it sort of not only added to the mood, but also reflected the way people would be in there on bank holidays, on their holidays, trips to the seaside. I think he was. I mean, Middleton also was a family man, and there's an awful lot of sort of just enjoying things that I think he the entertainment that other people would have done, that even though he might seem detached from all that, I think actually he was someone who very much enjoyed and appreciated that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dickon, thank you so much for illuminating the pictures, and of course people will be able to view them from Friday the 3rd of December right through the weekend and on up until Wednesday evening, and the auction takes place at 6 p.m. on Wednesday the 8th. So once again, thank you so much for all your contributions, Dickon, over to the catalogue. They're always sort of marvelous to read, and as I say, very illuminating. And thank you for joining us to explain to just a bit of feedback or background onto these particular paintings. So thank you, and we talk to you soon.
Thanks very much. Thank you.